The heavy, humid air of Iron Ridge Penitentiary was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, industrial bleach, and the low-frequency hum of 1,000 desperate men. Inside the concrete labyrinth of Block 7, time didn't move in hours, but in the slow erosion of a man's spirit. At the center of this world was Leo, a 19-year-old boy whose frame was so slight it seemed the prison uniform might swallow him whole. Leo was a quiet soul, a boy who had been swept up in a system that didn't care about his innocence or his grief. He spent his days in a corner of the yard, tucked away from the predatory eyes of the gangs, staring at a small, weathered photograph. It was a picture of his mother, taken just weeks before she passed away. It was the only piece of the son he had left in a world made of gray stone and cold iron. The hierarchy of Block 7 was dominated by a crew known as the Jackals, led by a man named Drake. Drake wasn't just a criminal, he was a collector of pain. He understood that in a place where you have nothing, even a memory has a price. He had watched Leo for weeks, noting the way the boy guarded that photograph as if it were a shield. To Drake, that kind of attachment was a weakness that needed to be exploited. On a Tuesday afternoon, during the chaotic transition from the mess hall to the afternoon yard, Drake and 3 of his enforcers cornered Leo in the narrow corridor near the showers. They didn't want his food or his meager canteen credits. They wanted to see the boy break. Drake snatched the photograph from Leo's trembling hands with a jagged laugh. He held it up to the flickering fluorescent light, mocking the woman's smile and the boy's desperation. Leo tried to plead, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried over the clanging of the cell doors. He told Drake that it was all he had left. He explained that his mother was the only person who had ever believed in him. But Drake only smirked, his eyes cold and void of any human empathy. With a slow, deliberate motion, he gripped the edges of the photo and ripped it in half, then into quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the damp concrete floor like fallen leaves. He then ground his heavy boot into the fragments, erasing the last image of Leo's mother forever. Leo slumped against the wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. It wasn't just sadness, it was a profound, visceral amputation of his soul. He didn't fight back, because in Block 7, fighting back against the Jackals was a death sentence. He simply knelt on the floor, trying to gather the shredded pieces of his life, his tears hitting the dusty ground. The guards, watching from the high gantries, didn't intervene. In their eyes, it was just another day of inmate-on-inmate friction, a problem that usually resolved itself with a body bag or a broken spirit. They didn't see the boy's heart shatter. And they didn't see the shadow that was moving toward them from the far end of the corridor. However, the Jackals had forgotten one critical detail: the man who occupied the end cell of the lower tier. His name was Silas, but everyone in the prison called him the Giant. Silas was a man of few words and terrifying proportions. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to span the width of the corridor, he was a mountain of a man who had spent 12 years in Iron Ridge without joining a single gang or participating in a single riot. He existed in a state of self-imposed isolation, a silent titan who moved through the yard like a ghost that no one dared to touch. Silas had watched Leo for months, silent and observant. He saw the way the boy shared his bread with the stray birds and the way he whispered to the photograph at night when the lights went out. When Silas saw the shredded pieces of the photograph on the floor, something that had been dormant for a decade began to burn. It wasn't just anger, it was a righteous fury that bypassed his usual stoicism. He stepped out of his cell, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor, completely eclipsing the light from the narrow windows. He walked over to Leo, who was still kneeling in the dirt, and for the first time in years, the Giant reached out. He didn't pick up the pieces, instead, he placed a hand the size of a dinner plate on Leo's shoulder. The weight of it was grounding, a promise of protection that the boy hadn't felt since the day he was arrested. Silas didn't say a word, but his eyes, usually as still as a frozen lake, were now twin furnaces of concentrated wrath. The atmosphere in Block 7 shifted instantly. Inmates who had been shouting and laughing suddenly fell silent as Silas turned his gaze toward the mess hall where Drake and his crew were gloating over their victory. Every step the Giant took was a declaration of war. He didn't run, he moved with a slow, rhythmic deliberateness that made the very air feel heavy. The ground seemed to vibrate under the weight of his resolve. Silas wasn't looking for a conversation. He was looking for the men who thought they could destroy a boy's only hope and walk away. The raw, tectonic power radiating from him was more terrifying than any weapon Drake could have fashioned in the machine shop. Elias reached the entrance of the mess hall, his massive frame filling the doorway. The jackals were sitting at a central table, laughing and recounting the look on Leo's face. But as the shadow of the giant fell over them, the laughter died in their throats. Drake looked up, his initial smirk fading into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to stand, to find some semblance of his usual bravado, but his legs felt like water. He told Silas to stay in his lane, to remember that the jackals had numbers. But the giant didn't respond with words. He simply began to move, and for the first time in the history of Iron Ridge, the walls seemed to tremble with the anticipation of his wrath. The first enforcer who tried to block his path was swept aside like a piece of straw. Silas didn't even use his fists. The sheer momentum of his body was enough to send the man flying into a stack of metal trays. The noise was deafening, the clatter of steel against concrete, but it was nothing compared to the silence that followed. Silas closed the distance to Drake in 3 massive strides. He reached out and grabbed the gang leader by the throat, lifting him off the ground with a single hand. The strength in Silas's grip was absolute, a biological vice that rendered Drake's struggle meaningless. He held him there, at eye level, his gaze boring into the soul of a man who had made a career out of cruelty. The giant's voice finally broke the silence, a low, tectonic rumble that seemed to come from the deep foundations of the prison itself. He didn't ask for an apology. He told Drake that some things were sacred, even in hell. He told the leader of the jackals that he had stolen something that couldn't be replaced, and because of that, Silas was going to take something from Drake that he could never get back. The wrath of the giant was not a chaotic explosion, it was a focused, relentless pressure that left no room for negotiation or mercy. As the guards finally began to scramble for their radios and batons, the giant tightened his grip, and the air in Block 7 began to burn with the realization that the old order was gone forever. The silence in the mess hall was so absolute that the flickering of the overhead fluorescent tubes sounded like lightning strikes. Drake, the self-proclaimed king of the jackals, hung from Silas's fist like a broken marionette, his boots scuffing uselessly against the air. The other inmates stood frozen, their plastic trays held midair, watching the dismantling of a tyrant. Silas didn't throw a punch, he didn't need to. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the giant was a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the oxygen out of the room. He leaned in close to Drake's face, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. He told Drake that a mother's memory was the only thing that kept a soul clean in a place this filthy. And by ripping that photo, Drake had declared war on the only light left in Iron Ridge. With a sudden, explosive movement, Silas hurled Drake across the room. The gang leader crashed into a heavy industrial table, the metal groaning under the impact. Before the jackal's enforcers could even process the fall, Silas was upon them. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that belied his massive size. He didn't use weapons, his hands were the only instruments of justice he required. One enforcer was pinned against the brick wall, the giant's hand flat against his chest, holding him there with the ease of a man pinning a butterfly to a board. Silas reached into the man's pocket, found a hidden stash of cigarettes and contraband credits, the currency of their cruelty, and crushed them into dust before dropping the man to his knees. The guards finally breached the mess hall, led by a sergeant named Thorne, a man known for his reliance on the baton. They arrived with shields raised and canisters of tear gas ready, but they stopped dead when they saw the scene. Silas wasn't rioting, he wasn't attacking the staff or trying to escape. He was standing in the center of the room, a lone monolith of righteous fury, while the most feared gang in the prison cowered in the corners. Leo, the boy, had followed the commotion and stood in the doorway, his face streaked with tears but his eyes wide with a sudden, flickering hope. Silas looked at the guards, then at Leo, and then back at the wreckage of the jackals, Thorn ordered Silas to get on the ground, his voice shaking despite the weapon in his hand. But Silas didn't comply. Instead, he pointed to the shredded remains of the photograph that had been tracked into the hall on Drake's boot. He told the sergeant that the real crime had been committed an hour ago, and that the guards had watched it happen on their monitors and done nothing. He told them that if the law wouldn't protect a boy's only memory of his dead mother, then the law had no place in Block 7. The tension was a living thing, a wire stretched to the point of snapping. The inmates began to chant, a low, rhythmic thumping of fists on tables that echoed the heartbeat of the giant. The warden, a woman named Holloway who prided herself on total control, entered the fray, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She saw the potential for a full-scale insurrection and realized that force would only turn Silas into a martyr. She looked at the giant man, then at the shattered boy, and then at the pathetic heap that was Drake. She knew Silas's record, 12 years of perfect silence, a man who had been a model of restraint until this very moment. Holloway signaled for the guards to lower their weapons. She walked up to Silas, standing barely at his chest level, and asked him what it would take to end this. Silas didn't ask for his own freedom or for better food. He made 3 demands that silenced the entire room. First, he demanded that Leo be moved to a protected wing, away from the influence of the gangs. Second, he demanded that the prison's digital archives be searched. Leo's mother had visited the prison once before she died, and Silas knew there would be a digital log of her ID and a photo in the visitor's database. He demanded that a high-resolution print be made and delivered to the boy before the sun went down. Finally, he demanded that the jackals be stripped of their privileges and moved to the hole for the duration of Leo's sentence. Warden Holloway looked at the faces of the inmates. She saw the shift in the atmosphere. The giant had given them something they hadn't had in years, a sense of shared morality. She knew that if she refused, she would lose the prison. She nodded slowly, a silent treaty signed in the middle of a mess hall. She ordered the guards to take Drake and his crew to solitary, and told the tech office to find the visitor's file. As the jackals were led away in shackles, no longer the predators they claimed to be, the room erupted, not in a roar of violence, but in a cheer that shook the foundations of Iron Ridge. That evening, as the lockdown buzzer echoed through the tiers, Silas sat in his cell, his hands resting on his knees. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by the familiar, heavy ache of his long sentence. A shadow moved outside his bars. It was Leo, escorted by Sergeant Thorne. The boy wasn't crying anymore. In his hand, he held a crisp, laminated sheet of paper, a beautiful, clear image of his mother, salvaged from the visitor's archives. It was better than the one that had been destroyed. Leo didn't have the words to thank a man like Silas. He simply pressed the photo against the bars so the giant could see it. Silas looked at the woman's face in the photo, then at the boy who had found his strength. He reached through the bars and gave a small, solemn nod. The giant's wrath had burned away the filth of the jackals, but in its wake, it had left behind something much more dangerous to the prison system, a sense of hope. As the lights dimmed and the block settled into a new kind of quiet, the inmates knew that the hierarchy had changed forever. The giant was still there, a silent sentinel in the dark, and as long as he stood watch, the memories of the innocent were safe behind the iron gates.